This is Cuba. Population just over 11 million. Location 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Separated from the U.S. by a virtual brick wall built between the two countries.
I don't hate anybody.
It's the ultimate grudge match, and neither side wants to beg.
Including my enemies.
The story dates back all the way to the 1800s with the Spanish-American War, but it's Fidel Castro's rise to power in 1959 that sent relations into a freefall.
Vale la pena morir.
In 1960, Castro's government seized all American-owned businesses, along with privately owned land and the basic freedom of Cubans. In retaliation, the U.S. cut ties with Cuba,
We are neighbors.
issuing an embargo on all trade. That was just the beginning of what has become a roller coaster relationship. There was the unsuccessful Bay of Pigs invasion,
Cuba must not be abandoned to the communists.
the Cuban Missile Crisis,
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba as an attack.
a massive exodus of Cubans to America,
The Fidel Castro regime of Cuba is acting as an international outlaw.
the Elian Gonzalez controversy,
I was saddened by what I saw on TV.
and then the rumors of Fidel Castro's failing health. In 2006, the founder of Communist Cuba falls ill.
Cuban leader Fidel Castro hands over the reins of power temporarily to his brother.
Temporary power turning permanent in 2008,
Viva la revolución.
when Fidel's brother officially becomes president.
Viva Fidel.
And now, over 50 years after a U.S. embargo on Cuba, transformation in the tiny island may slowly be taking shape. Government reforms,
This is the first business in the area.
freedom on the horizon for Cubans. Or is it?
The changes are truly insignificant.
Tonight, as the new Cuba takes shape, those who have fled, my family included, contemplate a return and the idea of retrieving what was once rightfully theirs.
Our family has property. Would you ever try to go back and get it?
And American businesses set their sights on what could be a lucrative opportunity a mere 90 miles offshore.
I've had my eye on the market for probably 15 years.
I'm Michelle Caruso Cabrera. This is the story of a communist country, its recent reforms, its people, its untapped potential. This is Cuba, Forbidden Fortune.
In Miami, Florida, Cristina Morales is packing for her upcoming trip to Cuba. But her bags aren't filled with clothing.
There's stuff that they cannot get there.
Rather, supplies for her brother's new restaurant.
I'm bringing different seasonings, like for chicken, garlic, species like they can put in whatever they prepare.
This will be Cristina's third trip in a year to help her brother, Miguel Angel Morales.
This is the first business in the area.
He's very happy because that was something you couldn't have or do in Cuba before, to have your own business.
Thanks to recent changes in Cuban law, Miguel can have a license to operate his own business.
You may be saying to yourself, big deal, he's opening a restaurant. But in this country, it is a big deal, because up until now, running a private business has been outlawed. It's been that way since the 1960s, when Fidel Castro came to power and took over nearly every single company, whether a big industrial conglomerate or a small vendor in the street.
Miguel's restaurant La Moneda Cubana was originally started by his grandfather, but was nationalized by the Castro regime. Now it's Miguel's turn at being a restaurateur.
You're the owner.
He's reopening the doors for the first time after decades of rule under Castro.
In 1964, closed for the nationalization.
Yes.
I'm opening this year.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Miguel says having a license to operate a business has allowed him to reach his lifelong dream. And in turn, Miguel is giving other Cubans the chance of a brighter future, teaching culinary students skills necessary to start their own restaurants.
It's all part of a new Cuban dream, which, in addition to business licenses, also includes the freedom to buy and sell homes and cars, all in the hopes of kickstarting a struggling economy.
The changes are truly insignificant and cosmetic at best.
Jose Acel of the University of Miami, and himself a Cuban exile, isn't buying into the changes.
You can refill cigarette lighters. You can repair umbrellas and prune palm trees. Those are the activities that are being allowed under this system. Those activities are not going to contribute to the economic development of the country.
What about the pizzerias and the hair salons? Aren't those some of the areas as well?
They are, but again, they're in the service sector. They're just 181 activities, all in the service sector. In order for any country to develop economically, it needs to export. It needs to earn currencies by exporting. None of these activities are going to contribute to exports in any way, shape, or form. The mindset for serious economic change is just simply not there. These are measures designed to reduce the government's payroll, to allow them to remain in power, but they're not going to bring economic development to Cuba.
But Ezell does believe there is hope for economic development in Cuba, and it could have a major impact on the United States if the curtain separating the two countries is lifted.
There will be significant opportunity for American enterprises in Cuba.
Coming up, U.S. companies ready, willing, able, and already doing business with Cuba.
I think we'll have open and free trade with Cuba one day.
And later,
Hola amigos y bienvenidos.
the one thing being sent to Cuba costing U.S. taxpayers $28 million a year.
The Americans would be better off if that $28 million was returned to the taxpayer.
When Cuba Forbidden Fortune returns. Since the early 60s, the United States has been at a near standstill with a country that looks as if it's still in that era. Call it a blockade, sanctions, or an embargo. According to U.S. law, as long as the Cuban government continues in its communist ways, visiting the country will be limited, U.S. citizens spending money there restricted, and don't even think about smoking one of those world-famous cigars. But there are exceptions.
I've had my eye on the market for probably 15 years.
Pat Wallison is a bean exporter and the president of West Star Foods.
Everything going okay today?
And in Cuba, beans are a big business.
The Cubans do love beans. Their consumption is the highest per capita of any country in the world, so they eat a lot of beans.
Some of those beans come from Wallison's packaging facility. But this isn't Havana. It's Corpus Christi, Texas.
When I tell people, they'll ask, what does your company do? And so, we export some beans to Cuba, and they're like, you can't do that, can you?
He not only can, he has for over 9 years, filling entire container ships with 10,000 bags of North Dakota-grown beans at a time.
The last shipment we did was about $3.2 million.
Paid for by the Cuban government, and it's perfectly legal. Thanks to a reform in trade sanctions on Cuba enacted back in 2000 by Congress.
This bill advances the interests of the American people,
allowing U.S. companies to export approved products to Cuba.
The so-called embargo is really very limited in scope today.
Jose Ezell is the senior research associate at the Institute for Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami.
The United States is Cuba's 4th or 5th largest trading partner today. And we have been all along.
And it's not just beans. In fact, there are hundreds of items ranging from chicken to chocolate. Even medicine is on the list of approved goods that can be shipped to Cuba.
And nearly all of the products going into Cuba are imported directly by the Cuban government itself through its import agency, Al Import. According to AgriLife Extension at Texas A&M, the U.S. exported $5.6 million in dry beans alone to Cuba back in 2010, $94.8 million in corn, $99.8 million in frozen chicken, and $17.8 million in wheat. Exports to Cuba from the United States peaked in 2008 at $711 million, but have declined in recent years. The simple reason? A lack of cash. That's important because in order for U.S. companies to export to Cuba, goods must be paid for in advance.
If you think about normal terms of trade, you have 30 days credit, 60 days credit, whatever. In the case of shipments from the U.S. to Cuba, Cuba has to pay for those goods before they leave the United States. If they don't pay, the goods don't go.
Jay Brickman is the vice president of Crowley Liner Services, one of the few companies with a license to transport goods there.
I think most Americans would be surprised to hear that we are shipping from the United States to Cuba, even though there's an embargo.
There are a number of things that are surprising about the embargo.
He says despite the decline in exports over the years, his company maintains steady business with the tiny island.
Every week, in fact, Crowley loads up a ship like this one full of containers with agricultural products and sets sail for Cuba.
Crowley's ship leaves on the 16-hour journey to Cuba from Port Everglades in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a U.S. port that could see business boom if sanctions are relaxed with the communist country. That according to Deputy Port Director Glenn Wiltshire.
If the embargo to Cuba were to end, would your port see more business?
We believe so. We believe so because there'll be an increase in demand for cargo movement to Cuba, as well as an increased interest in passengers who want to visit Cuba.
A significant increase? How big do you think it might be?
We believe so. We've seen numbers that would be 100,000 TEUs, which is about a little over 10% of the current level of activity.
Wow.
But that would just be a starting point.
Westar Food and Crowley Liner Services also see a bright future in what for so long has been considered a forbidden country.
It's great business. I mean, it's almost like adding another state onto the U.S. 11 million people that are bean consumers. That's taking a half of Texas and opening a whole new market up for us.
Cuba is sort of like going back to the future, because when you look in the 50s at the enormous amount of trade and relationships between the United States and Cuba, there's no reason why a lot of that won't return.
But relationship building isn't as easy as it sounds.
They try to jam our TV signal.
Coming up, broadcasting to Cuba.
Is this propaganda?
Inside the $28 million message machine paid for by taxpayers like you. And later, Cuban Americans, including my family, struggling with the idea of someday reclaiming their land.
It was ours by the laws of nature. It should return to its original owner.
When Cuba Forbidden Fortunes returns.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, roll please.
This is TV Marti. It's part of a $28 million government-run program paid for by U.S. taxpayers.
Gonna start with your white shirt.
And it's not just TV. There's radio and a website, all with the same goal, to send news and information to Cuba.
We are connecting with the people inside Cuba.
Carlos Garcia Perez is the director of Radio and TV Marti, a multimedia platform operated out of Miami, Florida.
What's the mission of TV Marti officially?
The free flow of information to Cuba. We give them the good and the bad news, but we tell them the truth.
The program is part of the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, which falls under the U.S. Broadcasting Board of Governors.
Is this propaganda?
No, it's not.
Even though it's paid for by the U.S. government and the original mission was propaganda into Cuba?
We have a charter that tells us that we have to give objective news and tell the truth.
But Ian Vasquez of the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, disagrees, says there is no getting around the fact that this is a clear example of propaganda.
Anytime the government backs a certain message, it is a state-sanctioned endorsement of a set of ideas, and I view that as propaganda.
And in his view, an unjustified use of taxpayer dollars. The day we visited, a program called Avanza Cuba, or Cuba Forward, was being taped. The show's topic, advice and encouragement to Cuban entrepreneurs.
En Twitter, @Avanza Cuba.
And those inside the island are given the chance to call in, collect, and seek advice.
People in Cuba call here?
Yes. They call, they text, they email.
And many of the questions are focused around the recent government reforms, allowing Cubans to start their own businesses for the first time in over 50 years.
Tell me about the entrepreneurs that call in. What are their stories?
They are ready to be independent from their government, to create self-esteem for themselves. I mean, it's amazing what they do.
But aren't they afraid?
They've lost the fear. It's still a dictatorship. It's still a very oppressive regime, but I think the fear has shifted. The people in Cuba are ready to start fighting for democracy.
Karen Caballero is the show's host. She came to the United States from Cuba in 1994. Why is market freedom important?
Because that's the only way that an individual can develop itself. And when you're talking about an individual, then you're talking about a whole society. If 1, 2, 3 individuals make this happen, then the whole society is going to be better. That's what we want for the Cuban people in the island.
But getting that message to the island itself has proven to be a challenge.
The Cuban government doesn't want TV shows like this one transmitted into the island, so they constantly try to block the signal. One way around that, a plane that takes off every day from the Florida Keys that becomes a TV transmission tower in the skies.
Cuba is in 1959 in terms of technology, so that's why we try to deliver the message the best way that people can reach it.
No HD.
No HD yet.
If all else fails, much of Marti's content is sent to Cuba on USB flash drives.
How do you get flash drives to Cubans in Cuba?
Through legal means.
So they get them, they receive them, what, in the mail or delivery?
Or delivery.
It's that multi-platform approach that comes with a big price tag. The 2011 budget for the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, $28 million. Money some believe could be better spent.
The Americans would be better off if that $28 million were returned to the taxpayer.
And the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations has questioned the program. In a 2010 report, the committee writes, U.S. government-sponsored research groups indicate that Radio Marti has a listenership of less than 2% of Cubans, and claims that TV Marti has any stable viewership are suspect.
Super.
But Carlos Garcia Perez, who took the helm in 2011, vows to overcome that stigma and continue TV and Radio Marti's assigned mission.
We are doing and executing the mission, Michelle, and that's what we're here for.
Playing what could be an important role in the future of Cuba. But what role do Cuban exiles play in that future?
Many Cuban Americans dream of going back to Cuba once the Castros are gone. Do you?
When Cuba, Forbidden Fortune, returns. Cigar rolling? Coffee drinking? Domino playing? All telltale signs you're in Cuba. But this isn't Havana. It's Little Havana in Miami, Florida. And this is Café Versailles. The local hangout in Miami for some of the 1.2 million Cuban Americans living in Florida.
Cheers.
Many of whom abandoned everything they owned to escape communism and come to the United States.
You come here every day? Yeah.
When Leo Alayón was exiled in 1976, the Castro-run government forced him to surrender his business.
In business, everything is good.
For others, it was their homes and their land.
Will you go back to Cuba to try to get that property?
No. This property is gone. Forget it. I never sold to the government my property.
They took
it. He took it.
But today in Cuba, there is hope for change. New government reforms now allow Cubans living on the island to buy and sell homes. However, many of those homes once belonged to those in exile.
You're a real estate developer?
Yes.
Your father was a real estate developer in Cuba?
My father was a politician in Cuba, first and foremost.
Armando Codina is arguably the most successful Cuban-American exile in the United States.
So we're building City Hall is finished. And
a now wealthy real estate developer who sits on the boards of Home Depot and American Airlines, Codina arrived in the U.S. at the age of 14 as part of a U.S. government program designed to get children off the communist island. He lived in an orphanage until his mother arrived 6 years later. Back in Cuba, his family owned many rental properties.
In theory, there's a lot of rental properties you could go back and try to lay claim on. Is that something you're interested in doing once the embargo lifts or once the Castro brothers are gone?
I've had more success than I ever dreamed possible, so how could I even imagine going back to take something like that from the people who have been there and have suffered? When the time comes that I can go back with dignity, I want to go back and say, what can I do to help?
But it's not a feeling shared by everyone. Many Cuban exiles dream of the day when they can reclaim what was once theirs. My mother is one of them.
I would like to claim my grandparents' homestead.
Why?
For my grandmother.
What do you mean?
That was her homestead. And I have to claim that for her.
My mom, Maria, arrived with my grandmother and my uncle in 1962 with only the clothes on their backs and what they could pack in one suitcase. The Cuban government wouldn't let my grandfather leave until more than a year later.
And that's my father, just like a movie star, like her favorite guy.
My mother strongly believes the deeds to her grandparents' and parents' homes should one day be returned to their descendants. In 2002, she and I, along with my grandparents, traveled to Cuba to see their old property firsthand.
There are families living there now. You've seen them.
Right.
What do you tell them?
Well, it was ours. So, it should, by the laws of nature, it should return to its original owner. And that's the way I feel.
And just as the exile community is divided on this issue, so is my family. Do you remember it much from when you were little?
Oh, sure.
My uncle, my mom's little brother, says he'd like to visit Cuba someday, but he has no intentions of trying to reclaim any lost property.
In my future, I don't see myself going back trying to reclaim land or anything like that. I really would like to go back to visit, but I certainly don't miss it to the point that I would want to go back to live.
But despite the differing viewpoints, my family and many other Cuban Americans all agree at least on one thing. Leaving their country for the U.S. was a traumatic experience.
Havana.
My grandparents, who now live in Florida, tell me it was like everyone in their family was dying because they didn't think they'd ever see them again. Still, my grandfather Miguel, 44 years old when he left, says he never regretted it. That coming to the United States provided what he and his family needed most, economic stability. And that's exactly what he, along with other exiles, wish for their homeland of Cuba. A country at a crossroads and perhaps on the brink of dramatic change.